Well, last week, as we came to the end of our teaching, I mentioned that where we were going to go this week was looking at the closing comments that Paul gives in his letter to the Colossians, where he lists the name of many of his co-workers, people who are in collaboration with him in ministry. And the thing I emphasized, that we have this idea many times that, Paul was just wandering around doing great things, and there may have been a few people around him, but they weren't essential. They were inconsequential in the bigger way of thinking things. And that grows out of our cultural context, not his. That in Paul's mind, in the people's mind, they realize that no one man can accomplish all these things. And there is an idea that if you cut off the head, you can kill the snake. And I'm sure that when the persecutions and efforts were made by the Jews and the Romans and the Greeks and others to kill Paul, that they thought if we can kill him, that's an end of this movement. Well, they should have learned when they killed Jesus, it was just the beginning of the movement called Christianity. When they killed Paul, it had already spread like a cancer throughout much of the world at that point. There was just no way of stopping this thing. And as we look back 2,000 years later, and we realize that, the largest percentage of people in the world at least identify as being Christians, although they may not be born again or particularly functional. But the fact of the matter is that Christianity has continued to spread and continues to spread. And the most interesting thing is it spreads the most rapidly and the most completely in the places where you would think the environment would prove it incapable. Whether we're talking about China or South America or Africa, where, 100 years ago, only 1% of the African continent was Christian. Today, 50% profess to be Christians. The same thing is in China, where it's illegal to be a Christian, yet Christianity has grown from a few million when it was closed to Westerners, to today there are at least 100 million Christians in the country, and maybe more. The same thing is in India, where Christianity is openly persecuted, and people are regularly attacked and accused and hindered because of their faith in Christ. And churches are often burned, pastors are often killed, and yet we look at the statistics now, it's gone from maybe less than 1% of the population to, well, now today there may be as high as 15% of the Indian continent are followers of Jesus Christ. So we look at these environments where the efforts have been made to crush the faith, and it's just exploded. You look at places like America, where people have been free to exercise their faith, and Christianity is withering on the vine. That we'd probably look at America and say that maybe 5% of the population are born-again believers. Estimates are no more than 20 million are truly what we call Bible-believing, biblical, born-again Christians. We have a lot of people who identify as Christians, but their identifying with Christians is about as real as a boy identifying that he's a girl. It's not something that's real. It's just something that's imagined. So in our day and age, apparently just being able to identify is enough. But anyway, moving on. As we look at Paul's ministry, we begin to realize that he had quite a cast of supporting people playing around him who were doing a lot of the work and enabling him to expand the work. In other words, the more people Paul was able to recruit to his ministry team, the greater was the extension of his ministry. Because in the end of the day, Christianity is always relational. And we may not think then that it is any longer because of the technological age and even the discussions of developing the meta church, which is the most abstract thing in the world. There's one church that after COVID, they never reopened. They sold all their properties, and now they have a meta campus, and they do meta services. So you go on, you sign up, and you create an identity for yourself, and then your avatar, if you will, goes to church service. He joins a home group, but basically all of your interaction is through a keyboard and a screen. You're not actually in contact with people and having connection and fellowship with people. And to me, I mean, I don't want to be too judgmental. Maybe God uses that in somebody's life. But AI Christianity is not really what the Bible talks about. Christianity is people engaging other people. And the problem with that is whenever you have a body, you have body odor. As I told somebody recently, I said, you got to understand that most Christians are pretty weird. I just happen to like quirky people, so that works for me. But a lot of people, they don't like the messiness of human relationships, and that's what they are. And so we have a culture that's moving away from human connection and trying to sterilize it and keep it on an abstract level. And so we no longer have direct one-on-one communication. We have virtual communication with people. And something is seriously lost in that. I mean, there's something seriously lost. I'm old school. If there's something important that needs to be discussed, I want to talk face-to-face about it. I do not want to text you, email you, or deal with you in any other way, because that's just so inadequate in communicating. And yet, I find that there's a lot of people who like to hide behind the email or the text message. When you say to something, hey, can we sit down and talk face-to-face, they avoid that like the plague, because it's the last thing in the world. Face-to-face is way too vulnerable, way too transparent. And so as a result, they just live avoiding that. Well, that's a choice people have to make. I mean, we have a freedom in this culture to do that. But I'm just saying that you're losing something in the middle of that. You're losing meaningful relationship. And, I trust you're saved and you're going to heaven, but life is hard enough. We're already in a war. We don't need to be fighting it all on our own. Well, anyway, who's the first one that Paul talks about? Well, in verse 7, he says, Tychicus will tell you all the news about me. He goes on to say, he's a dear brother, a faithful minister, a fellow servant in the Lord, and I am sending him to express the purpose I'm sending to you for the express purpose, that you may know about our circumstances and he may encourage your hearts. So Paul understood, I'm physically sending a representative to speak on my behalf, not only to bring people up to date with what's happening, it's just not reporting the news, but it's also to let you know that he's there to minister to you. You can trust him. He is a servant of God. He's there not to please himself, but he's there to serve the body of Christ. And he'll let you know what's going on and encourage your heart to see how God is working through the difficult things that I'm having to face. Now, we pronounce it Tychicus, but it's actually Tychicus in the Greek. And we know a few things. He's mentioned 5 times in the New Testament. And what we know about him, he was a Greek, he was a Gentile. He came from the area of Asia Minor, someplace probably in what we call modern-day Turkey today. We find that he's with Paul on his 3rd missionary journey. And we also find that when Paul is in Crete and when he is in Ephesus, that Tychicus is also there, and Paul sends him to be an interim pastor of sorts in those cities, filling in really for Titus and Timothy in his absence. So this was somebody that Paul really had really entrusted not only to communicate on his behalf, but to represent him and then bring back accurate information. And every one of us knows to make good decisions, you need to have accurate information. Well, fourthly, we know about him that he was one of Paul's companions when Paul makes the journey from Corinth to Jerusalem to deliver a financial gift to the church in Jerusalem. And so he's probably also with Paul during his imprisonment when he's in Caesarea and later on when he's Rome. And which means that he had to be one of the survivors in that shipwreck with Paul when they sank off the coast of Malta, as is recorded in the last couple of chapters of the book of Acts. But I think most importantly, he was probably the one who was entrusted to carry the letters to these churches. And there's really listed 3 or 4 churches. There certainly is Colossae, Philippi, Ephesus. It mentions Hierapolis and Laodicea, part of those 7 churches of Revelation. So this was a guy that Paul would give this letter, which, I mean, again, these were very valuable items, and they were entrusted to only the most reliable of people. So it says a great deal about this man that Paul said, this is my emissary. In fact, he may also be mentioned in 2 Corinthians 8 because there is reference to an unnamed believer who is going with Timothy, but it seems to line up with all the events where Paul describes this individual as a brother who has often proved to us in many ways that he is zealous, and now even more so because of his great confidence in you. So he's somebody who is not well known on earth, but he is regally known in heaven. He certainly heard from Christ when he arrived, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant," which leads me to really this comment that the idea of somebody being faithful is not something that we hear that much used as a compliment. And yet, in the end, it's probably the most important thing that can be said about you. It's kind of like you may start well, you may prevail in the meeting, but what if you never end the journey? And I think about how it's one of the names that was given to Jesus, where it said in Revelations 19:11, John says, I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True and Righteous. And in righteousness he does judge and make war. So these things of being faithful, being true, in other words, true in the sense that there's a consistency. You're not going to find something in the middle that isn't really congruent with the whole. And he said, basically, this guy Tychicus, you could cut him open and you would find that who he was on the outside was exactly who he was on the inside. And that was something we call the height of integrity. So here's a guy that I think is really a great role model, and we would do well to pay closer attention to the example he set. Not famous in our world or even in his time, but he was a man who was honored because he could be trusted to death. We'll pick it up tomorrow. God bless you.